include Eleni, Bardaka, Louie as our panelists for this afternoon. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves and talk in conversation with what we've just heard and through the lenses of their individual research using questions that we started with. We have a smaller group now, so it's a little more free form. I anticipate we'll have lots of opportunities for folks to ask questions of the panel and for Dr. Agyeman to jump in or respond as we go through. So without further ado, I'll let you take it away.
Is this on? Okay. Hi, my name is Dara Bloom. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural and Human Sciences here at NC State, and I'm a local foods extension specialist. So I have a research and extension position. I do very little teaching, although I do a lot of teaching in terms of working with our cooperative extension agents who work out in their counties. So how many people are familiar with extension? Okay, great. Then you don't need a lot of explanation, and I'll talk more about my role in terms of providing local food resources to cooperative extension and how we frame that, I think, through the panel questions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eleni Bardaka. I'm an assistant professor in civil engineering. I mostly focus in transportation planning and economics. I had a really cool picture from ArcGIS as my introductory slide to impress you, since this is a geospatial center, that I can use ArcGIS, but the logistic didn't work out. So my work focuses a lot on the socioeconomic impacts of transportation investments and policies, and also on transportation equity and accessibility. And I will talk a little bit more about that.
Oh, okay. My name is Louie Rivers. I'm in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources. I also had a cool picture, but I'm glad you can't see it because I have the same shirt on as I have right now. So it's been slightly awkward. I wear stuff over a lot. My work focuses on looking at contentious environmental issues in minority and underserved communities, really from a cognitive psychology perspective. And touching on a lot of the stuff we've talked about today and really thinking about environmental justice aspects of that type of work. And I think should we go ahead and start with questions maybe? Sure. We're gonna try to make this look really natural. So Bethany did a really good job of organizing us. So we're gonna kind of go through the questions, but I think we're a small enough group now where we can have more questions come out from the audience. So I guess we'll start with a question for Eleni. Oh, yeah, I put my phone away. I have the question. But maybe if you could just talk, maybe you can talk about how being an engineer and thinking about these ideas of just sustainabilities. And also there's this kind of stereotype of engineers not thinking about these type of issues. I mean, you're not, clearly you're not that type of engineer, but the US Army Corps type of engineer, those type of critiques. So how do you think about these type of issues in your work, and do you ever have headbutts with your colleagues or anything?
Yeah, so I don't have a license to practice engineering, really. So, okay, so I am a transportation engineer by training, and I also have I did a master's in economics when I was doing my PhD in engineering, because I wanted to bring that into what I do, and I work with geographers and planners because I just learn a lot from them. Maybe they learn something from me. So transportation engineering traditionally has not considered equity, I guess. I think there has been a wave of research related to equity the last 10 to 15 years. One example comes from my work. My work is now, well, a big part of my work has been on transit and gentrification. But before we started looking at that, for over 30 years, we've been studying the direct economic impacts of highways or transit projects on the property values. So we were studying how and a lot of economists were studying that too, not just transportation engineers, how by changing the accessibility of a neighborhood and the aesthetics, of course, and by the public making such a large-scale commitment to a project, how that attracts development in terms of residential and commercial development, and how that impacts values and the timing of that and so on. But it wasn't until probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago that researchers started asking, oh, and what happens to the people of those neighborhoods? And it's kind of, it was very weird to me when I was a PhD student and I started doing that research. I couldn't find any papers on transit and gentrification or displacement, but I could find hundreds and hundreds of papers on precisely measuring the increase in property prices. So that's where my passion started about studying this. And I think now there's a lot of people who study similar topics, and there's also interest from the state. And I would like to hope that it's a genuine interest and it's not superficial. I just started a new project with the North Carolina Department of Transportation looking at the potential impacts of transit in North Carolina, of the planned transit projects in North Carolina and some of the existing ones like the light rail in Charlotte. And so I'm working with a professor from UNC Charlotte, a professor in geography, Jean-Claude Thiel, and we will be looking at how the light rail system in Charlotte, but also the planned projects around the state may impact neighborhoods, may gentrify, which areas are going to be more vulnerable, and also not just predicting, but also looking what has happened in other areas in the US to be able to say something about North Carolina. And one topic that hasn't been studied at all really is displacement, because it is very difficult to measure displacement. You have to have data before the project started operating, and we never think about collecting data before. But because of technology, there's some new opportunities and data sources that we can use to be able to say something quantitatively about displacement. So we're very excited to be looking into this. That was a very long response. Yeah, maybe any questions or comments from the audience or from Julian?
I'm already mic'd.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So that I can jump in if any of you say anything that. No, one thing I'm thinking about, and I absolutely think you're right, that engineers used to have this, and well, yeah, they used to have this singular focus on a solution. They were solutions oriented, linear thinkers. I get more and more Tufts engineering students now come into my sustainable communities class because they're starting to think, hang on, we're not just working in a vacuum. There are people in places. I mean, yeah, it sounds strange to those of us who are people, but people, academics. But a lot of engineers are just taught to decontextualize. So I'm pleased to hear that there is a change. One thing that I think is interesting, though, in Copenhagen, for instance, so they've got a new metro system in Copenhagen, and they are using value capture taxes to capture value from places that are benefiting from what is a public asset, and then they redistribute this money to other places. And sounds a little bit socialist for the United States, perhaps, but no, land value capture is happening in a lot of places around the world that are not socialist places, that are capitalist places. It's maybe one way that we could look at recouping some of the value and benefits that some people are gaining to their homes and whatever. It is a redistributive tax, but if we think of it as a public good and that it's building towards, the city generally, the same as congestion charging in London and Singapore and Stockholm and Milan and soon to be New York. It's going to happen in Boston as well, and Seattle and LA and San Francisco. It's just got to happen where you've got an urban core that is small. It cannot just keep accepting more vehicles. And in London, the way that former Mayor Ken Livingstone sold it to people was every penny that is collected will go into sustainable transportation. It's not going to go into some coffer and just get spent, whittled away on. So you can see improvements to bus lanes, to sidewalks, we call them pavements, sidewalks, cycle lanes. There's about $300–400 million a year collected that goes into this. So I think there are some taxation possibilities around transportation that can be redistributed and for the common good of the city concerned. But that's the art of the policymaker or politician, is to sell the public good rather than we're going to burden you with the tax and you're not going to see any benefits.
Yeah, I think that transportation planners I like to think that we have evolved a lot from the times that planners would make the bridges too short to not allow buses to go through certain areas, and all these very big examples of architectural exclusion. But I think that we just keep harming, just doing it in more subtle ways. And what you talked about greenlining, the same happens with transit projects.
Sure.
And now we see the solution of affordable housing, and we put a lot of effort into what we call equitable transit-oriented development. It used to be just transit-oriented development. Now we added equitable in front of it. It is a lot of different policies, but I guess the main one is bringing affordable housing close to transit and using some of the funding that comes from the federal government for transit development to also build affordable housing or mixed income housing. And we see that even that is so difficult to accomplish, bring affordable housing close to transit. It is very difficult. We also see that a little bit naively, and I'm trying to do some research on that, because we think that just by developing these affordable housing units, which, by the way, we have a huge shortage of, we built 1,000 of them, and we think it's a big accomplishment, while we lack 40 and 50,000. We see that, like, we solved these people's problems because we put them on an affordable housing unit close to a light rail station, but we never asked them where they want to go, if this is where their job is, or if they actually want to use transit, if they can use transit, or if it takes them where they want to go. So yeah, I think we have a long way to go.
Just on that, and I think it's laudable, several questions arise. What is affordable? In Massachusetts, it's calculated on a state-based index, which is completely unaffordable to people living in some of the poorest neighborhoods. So, and again, we need to think about, what is local? What is the affordability for local areas, rather than one criteria based on the state. So affordability, I think, is one of the key issues there. What was the final point you were making? Because I had just a little. Yeah, the access question. We're all about mobility. We don't want people just moving around cities. We need to know where people want to go and how they want to go there before we start developing mobility strategies. And I see engineers and some planners as implicated in just planning for mobility rather than access. Access is the equity aspect of mobility. And actually, if you Google, I do a piece, there's a company called Here Technologies that are doing mobility-based apps and things. And they interviewed me, and I said this, that mobility is a hollow solution when you don't think about access. And access issues become more and more important the poorer you are. Wealthy people don't have access issues in any shape or form comparable to people on lower incomes.
So how do you guys think that the use of technology through innovation would help the issues like congestion and social injustice and things like that? So a few examples. I started seeing companies, private companies popping up, providing technology solutions for like last mile and first mile access to transportation points or important locations like food sources or grocery stores and things like that, or implementation of using renewable energy sources through microgrids and things like that. So kind of connecting to your point, how do you think use of technology through innovation will play a role in the future?
Well, a couple of things here, and and I had to rush slightly at the end of my presentation, but the book Sharing Cities is about what truly smart cities are. Some people and some cities see smart cities as just wired cities. I see a smart city as the city that improves the lives of all its citizens, especially those who are most disadvantaged, through the use of smart technologies. And there is one over success that is a very good example of where social justice was never intended, but it actually happened. And so some of you could have won a book on this one. It is real-time bus information. Who uses buses? Real-time bus information has been an absolute godsend to a lot of people. And I would argue, and I don't know, I mean, the engineer may be able to tell us, but I would argue that maybe a few more middle-class people are starting to use buses now because you know when the bus is coming. Because before, why would you stand in the rain and wait for something you didn't know that was going to come? So real-time bus information. But to your point, I still think most innovations are what I call lifestyle innovations. I want to see innovations for livelihoods, the livelihoods of the poorest people. Where are they? Where are those livelihood innovations rather than, the 100 or so apps that I've got to make my already very nice life a little bit better? What do livelihood innovations look like? I mean, you're bright kids, come on, go out and you go out and develop me some, you think, I know you are, no, seriously, but this comes back then to my point about what the technology, does the technology industry look like America? We know it doesn't. When it starts to look like America, then we'll have people, bright kids from low-income neighborhoods, really bright kids, saying, hey, this would have really helped my gran, or this would have helped my uncle, this would have helped X, Y, or Z. That's what we need. And so I want to see these technologies be available to people to improve livelihoods, not just lifestyles. Hey, don't get me wrong, I love the lifestyle apps, but I really think Silicon Valley is missing an investment opportunity in these kids in low-income neighborhoods who've got dreams and ideas just like anybody else has.
Slightly along those same lines, when I was listening to your talk, I thought of something that a scholar, Danielle Purifoy, said. She suggests that climate change is driven by racism. Our need to oppress and distance has led to disastrous but systemic decisions for how we develop urban areas in our natural world. So to me, I thought of it when you're talking about this idea of recognition. And to me, this is a critique of us as scientists. Often when we think of environmental issues, we think of the social parts being on the back end. But what would it be, how would we operate differently if we were to think about the social parts driving how we interact with the environment? So it kind of turns the whole thing around. And for those of us who submit to the NSF, what if the broader impact became the thing that was the most important part of how you get your grants? And so when I hear about these technological solutions that you're talking about and a lot of the engineering ideas, not to pick on our engineering friend, I think all of them are just half measures until we recognize the fundamental problem of racism in our society and how it's so baked in. Because we can have all these solutions, but if we still have a fundamentally racist, fundamentally gendered society, I'm not sure if we will ever really move ahead with the best engineered solution. It was a statement, but also I can open it up to people to say, you know, to comment on. Because, like, you know,
Yeah.
what I'm suggesting is that, like, science should be driven by these social needs and not the other way around, which is often the case.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at, you know, if you look at our economy, you know, the market, there's nothing wrong with markets. I mean, I could argue, I could make a really good argument that markets are actually shared resources. They are great examples of where we share to distribute in many ways. But one of the problems with markets as they stand is that markets today under neoliberalism give us our values, whereas what we should be doing is imbuing markets with values. I do that personally through my 401k. I use Fidelity, Brokerage Link, managed by Progressive Asset Management Boston. So I constrain the market in which my funds go, because I figured if I'm going to critique universities over their climate investments, their fossil fuel investments, then I better be squeaky clean myself. Very few of my colleagues have done that. But so the point is, markets, you know, we need to constrain markets by giving them certain values and making them work for us. So basically, you know, markets work in the benefit of humanity rather than for those few who shed loads of money out of it. And similarly with science, I mean, let's put values into science rather than science giving us our values. Would we have the rise of racial science, the re-rising of racial science, if we constrained science by certain values that were explicit and upfront? But we don't. So we have these people who are coming out with and, you know, regurgitating Victorian ideas about racial superiority. And so I think, and just on our engineer, are you a recovering engineer? Is that, can we say you're, because I think, you know, you're a recovering engineer, you know, you're not.
I never felt sick.
You really are.
I want to hand it over to Dara, but I think most of the science that we do here in the United States are deeply steeped in values. We just hide them so deeply that people assume that they don't have values. So, like, we just say that we have these methodologies, but why do we have them?
Yeah, and I was just going to comment on kind of the idea of imbuing our markets with values as well, because I feel like from a food systems perspective, that's often how we approach transformation and change within the food system, is to encourage people to vote with their dollars and to really try to, you know, we all eat every day, so those purchases that we make can really be influential. And I support that, and I agree with it, but I also think that we have to also recognize that there are limits there. I mean, just the concept of voting with your dollars is inherently undemocratic, and it has a limit. And I think really trying to shift the conversation to say, you know, again, I work on food systems issues, and say, you know, we're not going to solve it all within the market or from within the food system, and to really remember that political advocacy has a role to play as well. And so, you know, that it's not just market-based change, but to say we can't leave everything to the market to solve. We have to think about how to form a real social movement, not a movement that's only about what you buy, and that takes political action as well.
No, absolutely. You know, in our book, Cultivating Food Justice, we absolutely start with a critique of the notion of voting with your fork, because only certain people can afford to vote with their forks and shop at Whole Foods or Whole Paycheck, as it's called. I mean, you like that one? You like that one? No, seriously, no. So it is very limited. But when I say values, I don't mean personal values. Like, you know, I can afford. I mean, Michael Pollan even said, just because some people can't afford to do it, we shouldn't stop those who can from doing it. Which I got a real problem with that. I also have a problem with what he said about, you know, don't eat anything your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. That implies that our great-grandmothers had choice. Many great-grandmothers were given the scraps off the table. Many immigrants to this country from all over the world, whether it's Eastern Europe or Africa, their food was demonized. So this idea of choice and freedom and individual choice, no, I'm talking about let's imbue markets with common values. Like, no to child labour, you know, coming off tobacco, military hardware, etc. It's tough, yeah, it's tough. But I'm talking about imposing values on markets, not personal choice values. Although I still think with 401ks, we should make the choice to pull out of. Yeah, but I take your point. And one of the things I think that is really problematic is, and you mentioned it, and there's a concept now, it's called post-politics, the post-political. Are you doing your bit for the environment? Politicians putting environmental protection on us as a sop for them not doing anything. And you'll see this if you look at, you know, are you doing your bit for the environment? Do your bit for the environment. Yes, we all need to do things, but we mustn't let that stop. That we mustn't, you know, deprioritize political action, massive political action, for individual choice.
And that actually, so that actually leads to another question that I had for Eleni. Okay.
Sure. So you brought up the idea. I want you to answer. So it's just, so you brought up the idea of like politics and like, you know, advocacy.
Yeah.
And like, how do you walk that line as like a scientist? Like, especially, I think we have a lot of students who want to be more advocates in their work. Mm-hmm. But then, if you're in the university, it's hard to get accredited for advocacy work. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I think we walk a very fine line, especially because we are extension and we're state funded. And so, you know, since I'm state funded, I cannot actually do advocacy within my role as a professor or as an extension professional. I can educate, but not advocate. So I think that's a line that we always walk very closely. But do you have some thoughts on that as well?
Well, yeah. So when I was researching the bit about the farmers in Maryland and their clients in the African community in DC, I found that University of Maryland Extension actually has funded research on African crops that will grow in Maryland, for instance. Now, is that advocacy? Again, fine line, isn't there? I don't think it is, because I mean, you know, in a sense, it's a commercial thing. I mean, it's making Maryland farmers aware what will sell commercially. And it also says something about which communities use these crops, recipes. I mean, it's common sense. It's just common sense. Yeah. It's social justice, and it's you know, sustainability in many ways. It's building more sustainable communities.
Well, and I think that often in extension, we've approached that as, you know, an educational idea of, you know, we're going to teach communities how to do something. And increasingly, we're taking the perspective, especially with local food system development, that we can be facilitators. And so we actually, here out of NC State, in partnership with NCA&T State University and the NC Department of Agricultural and Consumer Sciences, we have the Center for Environmental Farming Systems, CEFS, and one of their projects is Community Food Strategies, which organizes food policy councils across the state. And so as a result of a lot of the work that they've been doing, just facilitating and working with communities, we actually have sort of the second largest number of food policy councils in the country after California. And that's very much about not advocating, because we have state dollars on us, but bringing people in their local communities together around the table to start talking about their food system, what they want their food system to like, having conversations about who should be at the table, what their priorities are, understanding how the food system works, and looking for like the little p policy changes and the big P policy changes. Like, what can they do sort of with practices within their community to facilitate more local food, and either supporting farmers, increasing food access, increasing health and lessening health disparities, or the big P policies, where a lot of them have hosted candidate forums. So they bring in local politicians and give the community a chance to ask those questions that are related to the food system and agriculture and how their food system is sustained. So I do think that we have a role. I just think that we also, we walk a fine line in how we do that. So I think providing information and organization to communities to be able to advocate for themselves, I think we have a role in that. Telling them what to advocate for is not necessarily our role.
No, and I think this is a great point for us as academics in the room and students who listen to us. I mean, in urban planning, it's very different. I mean, you know, we as a department, we are explicit on our website about the values that we hold. you know, you cannot do value neutral urban planning. It just doesn't happen. Every space, every place is racialized. It has histories. It's dripping with context. You can't plan out of you can't engineer out of context in many ways. And so we are operating in a political space as both as urban planners, training the next generation of urban planners, and as academics researching. I mean, you know, I've got colleagues who are, you know, particle physicists, and you know, they must sit in a room and just live in their heads. Or that's not my kind of academia. I want to be doing things, coming up with constructs that are useful to communities in the real world. Is that advocacy? I don't think it actually is. I think what I do is help people think differently about things, critically about things. Not saying that like complete streets shouldn't happen, but who gets to define? The questions of who and how are often the questions that I ask. And it's always the equity and social justice questions. And these are the higher hanging fruit, obviously. I mean, the reason why we've kept environmental and sustainability issues to science is because that's the low hanging fruit. We know the science of sustainability. We know how to be sustainable on this planet. We're just not doing it. And those are political and public attitudinal issues, I think.
And I wanted to go back to something that Dr. Agyeman, that you said earlier about sort of the individualized decision-making versus kind of thinking about the broader structure, because I know as we were preparing for this panel, Eleni and I had a really interesting conversation about sort of the role of autonomous vehicles versus public transportation. And I think, because in my work, transportation is a huge issue related to food access. And so I often find myself arguing to think about food access issues as issues about access to public transportation and not about proximity to supermarkets. It's not about if you're a mile or 10 miles to a supermarket, as we often define quote unquote food deserts, which I don't like that term for a whole other reasons, which we can talk about. But I find myself thinking that the solution is to advocate for public transportation. And I know in the conversation we had leading up to this, that you had some really interesting thoughts on the potential role of autonomous vehicles. In my mind, which I always saw that as sort of an individualized approach, but I'd love for you to speak a little bit more about, you know, how you see that fitting into kind of this just sustainabilities conversation.
Sure.
And that relates actually to your question that you were asking about emerging mobility. So, as you said in the last probably the last slide of your presentation, equity and justice is not just going to happen, right? So I do believe that public agencies have an important role when it comes to technology, and that is to make sure it's going to work in an equitable way. So we do experience some sort of revolution in transportation, or maybe as engineers, that's what we like to think about the future. But there's a lot of money being thrown into vehicle automation right now. We have shared services, but we envision a future with shared and autonomous services. And we may like to think that this is automatically mean higher accessibility, it is going to mean lower cost. So imagine an Uber without a driver. That's going to bring your cost down per ride a lot. And it's going to be more accessible to more people. But we do have to work a lot to achieve equity. Why? Because the private companies who will own these vehicles chances are they will want to maximize their profits, right? So the special distribution of those services may not be equitable. We may see concentration of those services where profit is maximized. So we have to work on creating artificial intelligence algorithms that are ethical. And we also don't want to see digital discrimination, which I think is another problem that is coming up with shared services. There has been some recent studies about Airbnb and how they have found that there is discrimination in terms of race when it comes to who is allowed to book an Airbnb. And we may see that in transportation as well. when we talk about shared autonomous vehicles, there's no driver. So who do you choose to ride with you? Who is allowed to ride? Which type of people are excluded because they make me feel unsafe, and things like that. So I think we are just starting to ask these questions. I'm very interested in this topic. I wrote a proposal to NSF about this very recently, and it's fascinating thinking about artificial intelligence, which is such a big buzzword. Everybody talks about it, but not thinking about the ethics is just crazy to me. So yeah.
Yeah, well, you know, just to build on that in some ways, I've been quite interested in bike shares for a long time. And I get calls from bike share operators around the country saying, hey, Julian, you know, our bike share's been up for 2 or 3 years now, very successful, the business model works, but we've noticed very few low-income and minorities using our bike share schemes. So I often say to them, well, on what basis do you consider yourself successful then? You know, clearly they're just considering themselves successful. But the point is, the word's business model. The business model is put the bike docks in wealthy Tony neighborhoods where people are going to pay, where people have credit cards. And the business model is built on tourists and commuters. Many low-income and minority people are not either of those. So the question is, what would a bike share scheme look like if it were built on and by people on low incomes? People, they need bikes, and there's a lot of people, I call them invisible cyclists. There's a lot of people from minority communities who can't afford the bus fare. We always hear those stories, you know, the guy that walks 11 miles to work, you know, and then his mates at work found that he hadn't got a car and he was walking and they buy him a car. You know, we hear these stories. I suspect there are a lot more people. And access issues are very important. I see the elderly Chinese man in my neighborhood every Friday at about 5 in the morning before the recycling is taken. He uses his bike as a pack horse, straps great big bags of recycling onto, and he pushes his bike along. His bike is his economy. So, but he's an invisible cyclist. He doesn't come up in cycling figures. So number one, I think there's a lot of people from minority communities who actually cycle, but are they cyclists? Because there's a difference. I cycle, but am I a cyclist? You know, am I the guy with the skinny jeans, with the fixed wheel bike? You know, we've made cycling a culture here in the US. You go to Copenhagen or Amsterdam and you'll see pregnant women, you'll see Muslim women, you'll see elderly people. In Copenhagen, I saw 2 people, we call it snogging and kissing while they were cycling. 2 young lovers, you know, can you believe it? You see North African immigrants. People bike because it's the culture, whereas here we've made it a cult, a club. How do we get out of that? And how do we make bike shares more equitable? I worry about autonomous vehicles because I can see the money coming out of what is left of money going into public transit and going into autonomous vehicles. I like the socialization. I'm trying to find somebody, if anybody, I will pay you as a research assistant. If anybody here wants to do some research, I've got a theory that cities with really good public transit systems are more social cities than cities without. That's my theory. And if anybody wants to do some research for me, we can Skype and I will pay you as a research assistant. We pay $20 an hour at Tufts, which is not bad. Seriously, I will take, if anybody who's from a transit planning, or if you want to come in on this, I just think it's really interesting because I think if we lose public transit, we lose something of that idea of contact theory, idea of public space and you know, meeting and talking. But it's interesting when you think of public transit though, you know, I think of sitting on the London Underground or on the subway in Boston, everybody studiously avoids talking. But then wait until the train stops in a tunnel for 1 minute. Eyes start going around. 2 minutes. 3 minutes, everybody's talking. Why? Because you might need each other. 5 minutes, people, especially if no communication has come, And especially in London, when you've got some of these lines are hundreds of feet below the ground, you start to feel very constrained. There is a socialization that happens, in crisis in these spaces. Anyway, that's moving on. But no, I worry about autonomous vehicles because I think it's just another sop towards more privileged people getting to do what they want to do. And actually, getting in an Uber with no driver freaks the hell out of me. I don't, and that's seriously.
That's a different topic.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, the stigma aspect. Well,
But we can move into a better form of public transportation. We don't need, for example, okay, and I understand the examples coming from Europe. I'm from Europe. I'm
Yep.
from Greece.
Yep.
I also spent an entire summer in Amsterdam, and it was amazing. I rode my bike every day. However, we cannot transfer that to the US context. We cannot transfer it to North Carolina. We have, unfortunately,
when you say we cannot, do you think, when you say we cannot,
at this point, the way our
we could to Boston.
population density, yes, Boston is a different story. But
Yeah.
we're not, but if we want to
Yeah.
talk about North Carolina, we have pretty low population density to support some areas may have the population to support transit, but some others may not. And what happens with the bus systems, the way they are right now, is in a fixed route type of service, they're very inconvenient for the people who try to use them.
Yeah.
And so I think we can move into something better. I also have fears about automation. I'm not saying that the future is fake, but I think that automation, even in transit, can help. Having smaller vehicles, more frequent or demand response vehicles is going to help instead of fixed route. I also don't like the transfer of ideas from other areas that do not fit our areas.
Well, just, look, the Boston metro region is one of the most dynamic regions in the world, driven by the collection of universities, medical centers, research funding, etc. It is already being overlooked, and you are benefiting here from companies that don't want to go to Boston because of high rents and whatever, and other companies globally looking for new markets who don't want to go to Boston because of transit. Boston is the Boston region, roads, public transit, despite the fact that we have a subway. I mean, most of the cars are nearly as old as me. The rail cars are 10 years younger than me. They're built in the late 60s. We haven't invested. I go to a coffee place in Kendall Square where 2% of the world's population is generated, in Kendall Square in Cambridge, right between Harvard and MIT. And you've got the 21st century above ground. You've got the Broad Foundation, which is a Harvard MIT cancer research. They will discover the cure for cancer. You get off a third world subway system and in 10 feet, you're in the 21st century. And you go down 10 feet and you're in the, in the 60s. We can't sustain that form of infrastructure. Companies are going to locate in other cities around the world. So this notion that we can't do it in the United States, yes, we actually can. We've got to just have the political will and vision to do it. That's the, when I look at somewhere like Copenhagen, and yes, it's Denmark, it's a capitalist nation. It's a social democratic capitalist nation, but they've invested in infrastructure such that, as Amsterdam has, they've invested in infrastructure such that they're investment havens. The reason people keep coming to Boston is they need to be there for the research power of the region. But there will come a point when traffic and transit issues start to dominate decisions about whether to relocate or locate in the Boston region.
I agree. And Boston is a different type of area than North Carolina. And I definitely, I never say we can do it in a bad way.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the transit cannot survive without the density.
Sure. No, I appreciate that.
So that's why when we talk about,
I'm highly skeptical also, just because going back to your previous point, I just fundamentally believe that the United States is so different from so many of the other international places that if you try to we created a highway system to take white people away from Black people moving to their cities. And if I say that, that's still not acknowledged by everyone in our society. So we can have all types of innovation from other countries, but I think we have this fundamental issue of race, particularly with African Americans, that we are not willing to address head on. So we can keep having all these workarounds, but I don't think we have the will to directly address those issues. So we'll keep creating the same imbalances in power that we see in other places unless we address it directly.
Okay. What time is it?
I never like to end on Louie.
I'm sorry, what?
It's about 5:30.
Ah.
Can I just say one thing before we end? Just really, really quickly, I'm just do a shameless plug myself because I know that Dr. Agyeman mentioned refugee farming projects, and I mentioned one in Boston. And I just want to make sure everyone's aware we actually have a really amazing kind of model refugee farm in Chapel Hill. It's called Transplanting Traditions, if you haven't heard of it. They work with Burmese refugees, primarily Karen ethnicity, it's an amazing community farm. They have about 35 farmers. They're at the Carborough Farmers Market. They have a CSA, and I think they're doing, I mean, just what you talked about in terms of, I liked your question of, is it geography or is it culture? And I think there's a nice kind of confluence of both in North Carolina because it's so hot. They're actually really enjoying this weather. Probably not the lack of rain. We also haven't had rain in a long time, but they can grow ginger. They can grow some of the Asian varieties, which are such a part, you know, we talk about food insecurity. And I work with this organization. I was talking with them yesterday about how the USDA food insecurity tool is so insufficient because it doesn't capture the fact that that this population doesn't feel food secure unless they can access the vegetables that they're used to. So I think there's therapeutic value to them to being on the farm, as well as sort of the food security aspect. And also they've also found the same thing that you mentioned, that they're informally distributing it among their community, which we don't count and we don't think about. And we are also trying to replicate that project in Wake County. We have a project called the Karen Community Farm, a group of researchers here at NC State, including myself, and we're working with some nonprofits in Wake County Cooperative Extension and a small group of Burmese refugees to try to establish something similar. So if you're interested about that, please let me know and I can share our fundraising opportunities with you.
Thanks. Any other plugs? Well, I mean, the more, I like to fight with Louie about where to end when there are students in the room. As broken and racist is a little bit of a downer. But I think it does provide a nice call to action to, as Dr. Agyeman mentioned in his talk, put equity first in terms of our thinking and planning and not as a tack on at the end. And to think about and design spaces in ways that aren't controlled by these ideas and that manage in ways that increase rather than decrease or marginalize intercultural contact. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for coming.